When we think of Africa, the image that often comes to mind is one of poor, starving children or of a place rich in raw natural resources that can be exploited. But they provide a very incomplete picture of Africa.
This is the new face of the 21st century farmer. The clothes that you're wearing today, it's cotton that has been farmed by the farmer. The shoes that you're wearing, that's leather that comes from the cows that your farmer has.
It's been 200 years since the United States opened its first consulate in sub-Saharan Africa. Throughout the history of Africa's tribes and kingdoms, there is also a common and recurring theme of female warriors who exhibited a sense of collectiveness and intense militarism.
Africa's first spaceport opened in 1964 near Malindi, Kenya. In 1970, the first satellite specifically for X-ray astronomy, Uhuru, was launched from Kenya. Why CodeWiz? How did it come about?
I've always had a passion for working with kids, and I've always had a passion for business.
Harvard's Global Health Catalyst Program, which was started by my guest, Dr. Wilfred Ngwa, to bridge the healthcare gap in low and middle income countries. Welcome to the show. I'm Vivian Kopsinger-Birchall, your host, and my special guest yet again is Mr. Melvin Foote, the president for the Constituency for Africa. Melvin, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
And we are celebrating Black History Month, and our conversation will rotate around Black history. And I'm specifically more interested in chatting a little bit about the foreign policy or the history of foreign policy and how it influenced Black history as we know it today. It's safe to say that your specialty is foreign policy, given how much of your work revolves around that. And so, in your opinion, what is this history of foreign policy and how did it affect the Black community?
Well, the first American foreign policy actually involved Black people very much because we were the policy. And the policy was to transport Africans to the New World, to the U.S. and throughout the Western Hemisphere to serve as slaves and build up the economy and build up the infrastructure of the country. And so, when you think about what was the first U.S. foreign policy, it was us. We were the policy. And I was at a meeting last week, and one guy stood up and said, most people think America was built on slavery, and it was not. It was built on economic policy. Well, that economic policy was us working for free, for 400 years. And not getting compensated. So sure, people got rich off of us. The country got rich off of us. The infrastructure got built because of us. So the first American foreign policy was actually Africans who were transported to the New World to serve as slaves here.
Absolutely. And, this year's theme is resistance. And I know that you've had a few conversations around resistance, but how did, what can you say about the resistance that happened as a result of this foreign policy, and how has that evolved over the years?
Okay, so we came here as slaves, and even as slaves, there was resistance. There were people who refused to be slaves. The first slaves actually were Indians. Their first idea was to enslave the Indians who were here, and they would work for free, right? Well, what the Indians did was they just ran off. How do you find them? They couldn't find them. So that's where the idea came. How about Africans? Because Africans can't run off. They can't swim across the Atlantic. We can immediately recognize them because of their skin color. So we became the slaves. So there were people who fought that from the beginning. And there were people who advocated against anything that looked like slavery. There weren't just Black people, white people too. John Brown comes to mind. And so the Civil War, of course, was fought over this issue of slavery. And But there were lots of people who even resisted back then. And so you fast forward up into the 1900s, 1950s, and Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, then John Lewis, Andrew Young, Dorothy Height, just scores of people, Stokely Carmichael, who advocated one way or another to resist this. And the resistance is part of who we are. It's in the DNA of Black people here. And we're constantly thinking whether you are on the front line or not. And I grew up in northern Illinois. My people got to Illinois by way of the Underground Railroad, basically. They were running from Jim Crow and slavery. And so millions of Africans left the South to go north and work in factories and survive any way you can. This was part of the resistance. So I grew up and not having known the South, I would ask my parents about the South, and my father didn't even want to talk about it. He said it was so bad. And so, my whole thing was, what role do we play? And that's what took me to Africa. I played basketball in college. I went to college on a basketball scholarship, and I went out in Colorado, way up in the Rocky Mountains. And I was just determined to get out of that place. All the people in Rockford knew were factories, hard work, and basically 1 or 2 steps above slavery. Basically, that's what it was. So I decided to get out there. And while I was out in Colorado playing basketball, I started a column in my school newspaper. I called it the back of the bus. So every week, this is way out in Colorado, you had nothing but cowboys and, people out there, and I decided that every week I would write about Black people. So I wrote about Martin Luther King. I wrote about Jesse Jackson. I wrote about every week I wrote about Black people. So one guy sent me a note, said he wanted to see me. So we met. He was a white American, and he was serving in the Peace Corps in Ghana, and he fell in love with his counterpart, who was Ghanaian. And so he wanted to marry her, and he wanted my opinion about that. Well, you love who you love. I'm not a love doctor. His parents was going to disown him and all that. He was just trying to make up in his own mind, should I go forward? I love this woman. Should I go forward and marry her? So I said, what is this Peace Corps? So he told me about the Peace Corps. And sure enough, I decided, yeah, that'd be interesting. So I put in my application. I didn't hear anything back for about 6 months. So finally, I had forgot about it. Finally, I got a letter back from the Peace Corps that said, you have been accepted and you're going to go to Ethiopia. I didn't know where Ethiopia was at. I thought Ethiopia was in the Middle East because of the Bible. And you got Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Ethiopia. And so you couldn't Google back then. These young people don't understand that. You couldn't just Google and find out where Ethiopia was at. So I had to go to the library, find an atlas, and found a map that showed me where Ethiopia was in the heart of Africa. Wow. So that's how I ended up going to Africa in the first place. I didn't know anything about Africa except what you saw on TV. And so I thought Tarzan was there, the white man in the jungle, and they talked in Africa, and he could talk to the animals and all kinds of crazy things. So I didn't know the difference. I mean, what am I to know? So I went there with the idea that Tarzan would be there with a herd of elephants to take us to the village. My father said, you're going to get eaten by a lion. So that's how I ended up going to Africa in the first place as a Peace Corps volunteer. And even now, I try to advocate. Peace Corps is it's a liberal organization, but I would say less than 3% of the volunteers are Black. Most of them are not. Why not? Because Peace Corps is a great experience, and a lot of the kids of aristocrats, the Kennedys, and they all go as Peace Corps volunteers to serve for 2 years overseas. And
why do you think the Black students or the Blacks don't participate in such an amazing program?
Oh, they don't know about it.
Okay.
And I was totally ignorant when I went, but I could give myself an A in terms of courage, because I went blindly. Not knowing anything about Africa other than what I had heard in the media: famine, Idi Amin, apartheid. I didn't know that people, and when I landed at the airport in Ethiopia, it shocked me that people were walking around with suitcases and neckties, and I was, and animals be coming by. That's what I really was thinking. I had no other way. So young people, fast forward to today, there's still this lack of information about Africa. There's still a lack of just basic information. Some of it is intentional. Africans don't know about African Americans. They were telling them that we're all gangbangers and crazy and all this kind of thing. So Africans don't know us, and then we don't know Africa. Like we're operating in the middle. You know me, and I know you. But the majority of African people don't know each other. And so one of the biggest parts of the problem, and that was intentional, they don't want us to work together. What I found was even now, when they bring Africans over here to put them in school and train them, that kind of thing, they don't bring them to Washington or to Chicago or to New York. They take them to Kansas. They take them to Nebraska, Oklahoma, way out west somewhere. And every once in a while I get asked to lecture. I went out to Kansas State a couple of years ago, and they had like a lot of African students out there, PhDs in biology and agriculture and all kinds of high technical things. Wow, I was surprised to see. I enjoyed the experience, but I realized they take them out there to indoctrinate them. They take them out there and take them to the church that they go to. They put the friends around them. By the time they end up coming to Washington, many of them end up in Washington with the U.S. government in some kind of way. They don't want anything to do with African Americans, so they'll live way out in Gaithersburg and Springfield, a place like that. They don't live in Washington. So they come in, they do their job, and they run off. So I found that part of the work I do is just trying to bridge the gap, and to increase understanding. And I think that is really where much of the energy needs to be focused on, is bridging the gap between African Americans, African immigrants. The reality is we're fighting the same battles. Africans are fighting colonialism, and it's the same thing as slavery. Call it another name. It's the same thing. Exploitation of resources, human resources, to make sure the empowerment is not going to take place among these African people, and make sure that they continually be vulnerable. And so I find that if you ask me what is the major thing that I do, the major thing I do is try to bridge the gap between African Americans and Africans.
That is a noble cause, trying to bridge that divide, because I have seen it in play, even here in Massachusetts, where you have groups of African immigrants trying to come together and trying to connect with the African American community. But it's a tough job. There's been historical distrust and among the two groups and divide, but it's not. It can be done, is what I'm trying to say. It's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it can be done. But let's take us back to the foreign policy again. In terms of, you've talked about the trailblazers, the significant figures we have in Black history, and regarding foreign policy, there have been trailblazers as well who are Black. I mean, the foreign policy initially was targeted against, the Black communities in Africa, but it has since evolved as the country grows, and there's been many key Black people in this foreign policy field. What can you say about some of these trailblazers, and what could they do to kind of make sure that the foreign policy that we have going forward does not negatively affect countries in Africa?
Well, when I came to Washington, I had lived, at that point, I had lived like 7 years in Africa. I speak Amharic, I speak Tigrinya. I lived for, in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, and I traveled extensively in Africa. So I'm very much an anomaly here. I'm an African American, born in America, but very much an African, And I would just tell an African in a minute, they say, where are you from? I'll say, I'm an American, I'm an African born in America. That's it, And we all are African. And the reality is not only Black people are African, even these white people that we're fighting, they're African too. I mean, everybody came from Africa,
Right.
And so, when I came to Washington, most of the Black Americans who were working in the space or Black space were focused on African American civil rights. And I recall coming to Washington, people looked at me kind of funny, because I would see people walking around in dashikis and that kind of thing. And I would go, if I'm coming to the World Bank or if I'm going to the State Department, I'm wearing a suit and tie, right? And they would look at me like I'm some kind of an Uncle Tom because I wasn't wearing, the right clothes or that kind of thing. So that was the first thing that I noticed when I came to Washington. And I didn't have any contemporaries who were also doing what I'm doing. I'm a pioneer in that regard. And so I found that it was necessary to build networks and so forth. And I still think that we're only at the embryonic stage in that regard. I've done everything I could, but it's still a long way to go to understand, what this matters. For instance, issues of immigration. Most Black Americans don't have any idea, what impact immigration has on African people. And so while African immigrants are very concerned about immigration, you'll find that African Americans don't understand why it's such a big deal, And then issues that African Americans face are, so again, there's this divide here. So what I try to do, I try to shift, the mission of my organization is to educate the public about Africa, improve cooperation and coordination among African organizations, Africans who are working on Africa, and then to shape U.S. policy toward Africa. And I would say that I've had a lot of impact over the last 25, 30 years. And a lot of the policies that we all know about, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, the Young African Leaders Initiative, PEPFAR, the U.S. response to Rwanda. I actually started, I was very instrumental in all of this happening. And you say, okay, how did that happen? I figured out a lot of things. I figured out that members of Congress, for instance, they're not so much concerned about the issues. They're concerned about getting reelected. And so you have to kind of make them understand that here's an issue that you can stand up and your people are going to like you because of it. And so they're going to vote for you. Oh, wow. And next thing you know, you got congressional leaders who are interested in subjects on Africa. They're not going to do it just based on the subject matter. You got to make the argument that this is going to help you to get reelected. And I did that, and I did it very successfully with AGOA, with PEPFAR, and some of this other stuff. And so we're now up to the point where when Obama was president, Obama sent an envoy to me and asked me what did I think he could work on. Because when Obama became president, the U.S. economy crashed. The Republicans basically crashed the economy. And so Obama could not focus on foreign policy. He couldn't focus on Africa. He had to focus on getting the U.S. economy going again, putting people back to work and that kind of thing. So he sent his envoy over to me because he didn't want to be seen as not helping Africa. And he asked me what I suggested that he focus on that don't cost a lot of money. So I said, first, I would not spend my time on Mugabe and Biya and Bashir and Museveni and your guy and all the other long-time presidents. I said, I would not spend my time on them. I will work on the next generation, the young ones coming up. He loved the idea. And that became the seed for the Yali. I told him to do a White House conference on Africa. That don't cost a whole lot. We were even talking about who would be the 4 presidents who would steer it and that kind of thing. That just, I'm saying that don't cost a whole lot of money. He loved the idea. That became the U.S.-Africa Summit. And during the Obama administration, they were going to do it at the end of the first term, but they had the oil spill in the Gulf, and that pushed it to the second term, and it shifted toward economics. So, but it was a great experience. You had all these presidents in Washington. It completely shocked Washington. Because Washington wondering all these cars driving around with the flags on them and whatnot. What is this? What's going on? And it was the U.S.-Africa Summit. And of course, Biden comes along, and Biden was the vice president then. And so he wanted to do the summit. And so I was asked again, about the Biden policy. And so CFA really, when Biden became president, that's when we put our network together. We crafted our policy recommendations for the Biden administration on Africa. And then we met with Molly Fee, who was the Assistant Secretary who is the Assistant Secretary for Africa. We met with Dana Banks, who was the White House Senior Advisor for Africa, and we met with several others and shared the paper and got debate going. And sure enough, 2 years later, when Biden announced his Africa policy, I would say 70% of it came from us, And I'm happy about that. We told them to focus on diaspora. And so sure enough, Biden announced that he's going to launch a diaspora committee to advise him on Africa, And
Right.
my meeting at 3 o'clock is about that, right?
There's been
Huh?
there's been conversations around who really participates, what kind of diaspora participates in these conversations. Is there anything you want to...
Right now, you would not believe the people who are lobbying me. Hey, can you get me on this commission? I don't even know if I'm going to be on the commission, because they tried to do something similar back during Clinton years, 94, 95, after the national summit, after the summit. And so the White House ended up picking the guy who was the senior director for Africa at the National Security Council, who was a military guy, wonderful human being, but military guy. How you got a military guy at the head of the diaspora? Oh, CIA. And so it really, they spent about $7 billion, nothing to show for it, right? And they had the same mission of CFA. They forced me to be on the board, but they wanted me to be way off in the corner and limited, access to the power. So here we go again. And now you're telling me it's going to be 12 people on this diaspora committee. How many are going to be African American? How many are going to be African immigrant? You got to have some young people on it. You got to have good gender balance. Half of them have got to be women. Half.
Yay!
Some are in Washington, but some of them got to be in California, Massachusetts, Florida, other places. So if you got 12 people, then you got to think about the arts, the culture. You got the artists, creative industries. You got private sector that's got to be there. So how do you pick 12 people? And you don't have a lot of time, because we're in the 3rd year of the Biden administration. So if it takes you 3 or 4 months to put this together, then you're only going to have about a year to really work. What can you get done in a year? So I don't know. I got a lot of questions. I'm happy that they agree that they need to have this, because this is my recommendation. But the devil is in the details.
Absolutely. And, the first time I heard about this, there were conversations around who makes up, this committee, because oftentimes the real African immigrants are actually not in those conversations. And there is some technical person who is working already in the government who is assigned to be a part of
what the government has done over the last 20 years. They replaced African Americans with African immigrants. And if you look at the Black people who are in the Biden administration, you would be shocked at how many of them are African immigrant. But again, they were trained out in Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, way off into the hinterland, and they come here highly educated, MD, PhD, blah, 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 but they don't call me and say, Mel, can we have coffee? Why is that? Because they're basically been programmed and told what to do. They put them in way out in the house, way out in the suburbs, and they're not linked into the African American experience. So again, it pits you against me, kind of a thing. These are the things that the next generation is going to have to do something about, because African immigrants, whatever rights you think you enjoy in this country or freedom that you enjoy, is at the expense of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, John Lewis, and all the ones who fought this system, for freedom for Black people. And
well, Mr. Foote, first of all, I'm just
challenged.
Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
I said that remains a huge challenge to how do we unify and work as a unified body.
Well, it starts with this kind of conversation. I am an African immigrant providing a platform with you, an African American, to have exactly this conversation and shed some light on these challenges and brainstorm solutions, mobilize the community, both sides, to come together and work for our community. So this is where it starts. And I'm so glad you're here with me today. But with that said, in terms of, I know we have to wrap up, but this has been an interesting conversation. It revolved around foreign policy and how it has morphed into what we have today. And so in terms of moving forward, how can we, in your opinion, how can we use or foreign policy, and also the organizations we have, media, CFA, to build a strong structure to address some of the challenges that you face, the division between the Africans and African Americans, but also the policies that could also, provide dignity to Black people, not only in the United States, but also in the continent of Africa?
Well, most Americans are uninformed, underinformed, or misinformed about Africa, period. We know that. We know that very clearly. But there's no resources to do it. And one of my arguments to the administration and my arguments to the Biden administration, they're going to help fund these efforts. I mean, we need to do town meetings on Africa all across America. I did that during the time of AGOA. That's how AGOA got passed. We had meetings in Memphis, Tennessee, Cleveland, Denver, Los Angeles, other places. We had African ambassadors talking about why trade matters, and that's how the trade bill got passed, utilizing the African embassies. Well, okay, I don't have resources. You would be surprised the limited resources I have. And over the last 10 years, all of those resources have dried up. Why is that? During the Trump administration, they basically told all their friends, don't fund anybody who is not walking down the street that they were walking on. And so all of the Black organizations, Trans-Africa, AfriCare, African American Institute, Washington Office on Africa, the National Council of Negro Women, Africa Action, and many others are disappeared. I'm really the last one standing here in Washington. And so we're going to have to find a way to resource this. Now, you got wealthy Africans, Antonio Lumulu, Dan Gote, and many others in Africa who got really tremendous resources, but they don't see the need or the desire to fund organizations in America, that even though we're lobbying for Africa. And so somehow, again, it's a disconnect between Africa and African Americans and the Africa world. And until we solve that disconnect, because white people are not going to fund us to take away their power. Why should they give me money if I'm fighting to educate Americans about Africa and empower the diaspora to have, an impact on policy? Why would they fund me? Well, they won't. So if they're not going to fund me, who's going to fund the organizations that are doing this work? If it's not us, who? And I just wish the Africa Union, I wish the African continent understood that, you want to have a relationship in America, American economy, American technology, and so forth. It's in your vested interest to figure out a way to resource the organizations on the ground, including CFA, that's doing this work. How we do it? I don't know. I'm getting toward retirement, so I don't know how much longer I'm gonna have to sit in this, this position. But I'm trying my best to make sure the next generation pick this message up and understand it. I think the struggle has gone on for 400 years. It's definitely going to go on for another 200 years, if not more. So this is not a short-term, one generation type thing. It's something that we have to make sure the next generation fully understands it and could take this argument much further along than where we are today.
Absolutely, and I want to put in a plug for media, because I think media plays a critical role in informing and educating the public, because one of the things that I've heard consistently is we don't know about this. African Americans don't know about Africa, and Africa doesn't know. And I think there is the power of the media that it's not yet tapped into, because the media was used to kind of portray the Africa that the African Americans know, one that has disease, that has wars, and it will take the media to change that narrative and to change that image, of course, in partnership with organizations that are doing more of the groundwork. So
controls the media would be my question. And a lot of times it's down to, if you got sponsors from corporations, for instance, to pay for it, the media needs resources too. And it depends on who's supporting that media for what purpose. So on the one hand, much of the Black media over the last 20 years, Jet Magazine, Emerge Magazine, Ebony, Essence, and many of these others, they've disappeared. They have disappeared. So we don't even have the ability to communicate with each other about what's going on anymore. And so I'm all for, I think the media does have a role, no question about it. But who controls the media is a key question.
Well, that's some assignment. We need to build a new media empire, and I'm up for the challenge. If you can direct me to where the funding is.
I should.
But again, the other thing that I wanted to point out as we wrap up is what role can we have a high diplomat who is African American, and that's Ambassador Greenfield, who has a big platform. What do you think she could do? I know you know her personally, to kind of advance foreign policy that could change the relationships or improve the relationships between Africa and the United States.
Well, what I find, because I'm not government, I am not a government employee, and I make that clear. But I'm not an enemy of the government either. I'm an African American. That means I love Africa and I love America, and so my relationship with a lot of these people is personal. They know what I stand for. And it's not like I've only come up 1 year ago. I've been around here for a long time. And so the relationships are very important in this regard, because they give you an opportunity to share ideals, to make recommendations, such as the Biden Africa strategy. That was not crafted by a bunch of bureaucrats in a room. We did that, we gave them the recommendations on trade. We pushed for small and medium-sized businesses, diaspora business. We pushed for a lot of the stuff that inside the Biden Africa strategy. So I think we need to learn from that experience. There's many other policies that we ought to be having impact on, be it a PEPFAR, the HIV/AIDS legislation. We need to, AGOA is coming up for renewal at the end of this year. And there's talk that it's going to not be renewed. Okay, if it's not going to be renewed, what is going to replace AGOA?
Cancer moonshot, maybe?
I think the diaspora has a lot to say about that if we can get organized enough to make the demand. If you don't make the demand, nothing can happen. If you don't put pressure, nothing can happen. So there are people like Linda Thomas Greenfield, Ambassador Johnny Carson, who are great people. But they need to have support. They need to have ideals, and they need to know that you're not there just to rubber stamp what they're saying. You're there because you really want a change, an improved U.S. policy toward Africa. So it's a relationship type thing. I'm not there throwing eggs at anybody. I do know all the people who throw eggs. They're my friends too. But I'm not an egg thrower. And so I can go into the World Bank. I can go into the State Department. I can go into the White House. I can go into all the halls of power. Because they know me as a trusted voice that definitely will share some ideals. Some of those ideals will be stuff that they agree with. And they were just trying to figure out how to go about doing it, because they don't know the diaspora. They don't know us on the ground. They don't know you. They don't know, that people on the ground. And so my job is to make sure I put you all in contact so they can hear your voice. Like when you post this interview, for sure, I'm going to share with all of them. They would all get copies of it, and that might create a problem for you, but they're going to get it.
Well, there's never a problem. It's just a conversation. That's why I like to, that's what I like to call it. And it's a continuous conversation. Today, it's around this and, the current foreign policy or relationships. Next year, it could be around something. And last year or 2 years ago when I hosted you, we had some of these conversations. So it is a continuous conversation that I'm happy to have with everyone. And if there are other people that you think we need to bring to the TV to just have these conversations, I'm happy to interview them. So, sorry?
I'll be happy to make some recommendations. You need to get Julius Garvey on.
Absolutely.
Marcus Garvey, he's my best friend, and he would have some interesting things to say on some of this. I don't agree with everything he has to say,
Yeah, and of course, I was introduced to you by Dr. Will Ngwa, who is also doing amazing work with the health policy.
Right.
And so there are many Black people or African diaspora who are doing amazing things, and I cannot wait to have more of these conversations out in the open, so that to the public, and to do my part to bridge the divide. Right. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for being my guest yet again. It's always fun having conversations with you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. Till next time.